Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this, welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya. This is episode 90, and I should just start off the episode by saying, what a wonderful day! As I am joined here by my sister, Hailey Naranya, to discuss Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I think would you probably say, Hailey, your most anticipated movie of the year?
I think it's up there. Yeah.
It was probably, yeah. It was on my list. I don't have it up in front of me, but if you want to go back and check on the social medias, you can. So we are going to be discussing that film today, the fourth film in the modern interpretation of the Planet of the Apes franchise. And then I don't know what number it would be if you include all of them. So as always, there will be a non-spoiler section of the review and then a spoiler section. Time codes will be listed in the description. And to round out the end of the show, we will be responding to listener mail, to question of the week, and you will find out what next week's question of the week is. All right, so let's move into non-spoilers.
What a wonderful day!
All right, so Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. This has been discussed already, so this is not a spoiler, just to lead into. So directed by Wes Ball, written by Josh Friedman, with an entirely new cast, takes place hundreds of years after spoilers for War for the Planet of the Apes, after the death of Caesar. What was your initial non-spoiler impression of the film?
I thought that the world was established very well. I think they did a really good job at showing us a little bit of a sneak peek into what the world looks like hundreds of years from the death of Caesar. And also a little bit of uncertainty, like not knowing what our lead characters like clan looks like, what the objective of their clan is, like hierarchy, things like that. I think the beginning was strong for sure.
I think that's a good point. It's an interesting jumping into. We've had a lot of these. This is a franchise revitalization. This is not an uncommon thing. The gap is significantly closer than, let's say, returning to Star Wars, which is a good example. But this still has a lot of that heavy lifting that you mentioned, which is we're getting closer to Planet of the Apes, the 1960s film, in terms of what's going on Earth. We've moved forward. One of the things that I loved most about the film, and we'll get into it in spoilers, but I could briefly mention it here, is that there's not a lot of, so here's what happened. And like everybody, like we are introduced to this world already in motion, right? We get every character is new, which I thought for the most part, they're developed fairly well. And the best compliment I can give this film is moving forward. I want to keep following these characters. That was a big deal. The bar was set very high with Andy Serkis's portrayal as Caesar, and not to mention all the other supporting character apes and humans to some degree in all previous films, right? Mm-hmm. You had Toby Kebbell as Koba. You had Scott, I'm going to forget his name, Steve Zahn. I want to say I got that right. Yes, Steve Zahn as Bad Ape. And so when that bar is set so high, and this being a film that has the potential, as is established in some of the way that the producers and directors have been talking about, wanting to continue to explore this world, I thought it was good. There are some familiar elements in the way that the story is established, but the most interesting part is, as you mentioned, is the world, right? It's a world where humans, this is in trailer stuff, so we can talk about this, where humans have continued that progression of becoming more like feral animals. It's one of the elements that I loved most about the way that the modern trilogy introduced those things was tease parts of how Planet of the Apes is set up, where humans are these feral animals. I think it's AC-113 or AZ-113, whatever the second version is of the drug that James Franco made, has continuously evolved in how it's affected the world. One thing, and this is in the trailers, which I wish they hadn't put in, which was that Nova 2.0 does speak and is like a smart human being. Having seen that in the trailers, I think that would have been a really good surprise, particularly in a world at this point that is, I wouldn't say is the Planet of the Apes, but it's pretty freaking close. And a lot of the things I was most nervous about, I think the film succeeds in. We talked about, do you want to talk about Noah a little bit, given how he's our lead of the film?
Yeah, like non-spoiler.
Sure.
Yeah, N Noah, well, we introduce Noah, and he's a very good climber. All we know is
Mm-hmm.
that he and his two friends are trying to steal an eagle egg, but we don't know why. Some sort of
Mm-hmm.
ceremony. We understand that he's quite brave, and follows the rules of his clan, but also a little bit timid when it comes to his parents. But I think he's just like a good, like, I was gonna say good human, good overall character, and a true
Mm-hmm.
protagonist. And I think how they introduce him is so smart, in the climb to catch the eggs, but also seeking like his parents' approval, or you don't know at that point. But I think the
Yeah.
development of his character and his two friends, is so good.
Yeah, I really appreciate the effort in establishing the different worlds that we live in. Now, we can't really talk about the
Hmm.
specificity into how things differ, but in terms of the production design and the way that the world evolved, particularly Dawn into War, Rise being obviously supposed to be present when it's happening, if not slightly in the future from when that happens. But as the Earth has continuously devolved to some degree, right? Like you could argue it's evolved because there's less humans, but in terms of the way that the sets are set up, where you really do feel immersed in this world. Like mankind's imprint is being pushed and pushed away. And I thought it was really captivating. I do have some issues with a little bit of the cinematography, which is at times, I think you lose what's going on. There's a couple night scenes that we kind of lose track of the characters. I did think there
Mm.
might have been too many. I liked a lot of the stuff we see with Raka, who's in the marketing as the orangutan, which I liked. Proximus is an interesting villain. Everyone on Twitter has been talking about Koba. Koba was amazing, but he had two movies to kind of be developed. He shows up in the first
Mm.
one just as kind of this angry bonobo, and then obviously we get to see of all the trauma he experienced growing up in the medical experiment situation and how that's really warped his perspective on humanity. And this being generations away from intelligent life, I think the way that they establish what people are aware of is really interesting. There's stuff in the trailers where we hear conversations about like, what do you know? And I thought that was really interesting. Like, what did you think? It's in the trailer, so we can talk about it. The part where we see, I almost said Koba, Noah seeing all the old human literature.
I think that's really cool. Like, I think in war, like you don't have an understanding of what the world will become after Caesar's death. Like you assume that his clan will live on, they'll be peaceful, Caesar's teachings and everything that he fought for will live on. But the fact that in the trailer Noah doesn't know about this was quite interesting. So you're like, okay, well then how has this world changed in the hundreds of years since
Mm-hmm.
Caesar's death? And I think they do a really good job. You're like, oh, I don't actually know. Like you have no idea. And I remember when I saw the beginning of Noah's clan, I would say. I was like, oh, this looks a little different than what we saw in Dawn. So then I was like, oh, that's interesting. And we can dive into more of that after the spoilers piece. But they really keep you guessing for a lot of the, I would say, the first like third of the film on what does this all look like, this world.
Yeah, well, the level of immersion is sort of revealed in multiple layers, right? We're introduced to Noah and his family, and we see them working with the eagles. It's I mean, it's on the poster behind me, and what that means, and their relationship to them, I found quite interesting. And we can get into like Caesar's rules or laws and whatnot, or the mentality that he's established in the previous ones, and if that is or not carried forward, because that's something I'm really looking forward to exploring. In in general, it is hard to talk about this because this is essentially a new trilogy where there's very minimal given away. The relationships between the characters, particularly with Raka, Nova 2.0, and Caesar, I found the most compelling. Ultimately, I don't know if Proximus works as well as Koba, but again, that's a really high bar, similar to Caesar to Rise. But on their own, I think you and I are both on a similar page where it's like, I'm ready for whatever 5 is called, right? Like the investment and reestablishing what the trajectory of this trilogy is really interesting. And for elements teased in the story that there's a lot we can't talk about, unfortunately, if you're only going to be listening to the non-spoiler section of this,
Hmm.
but that ironically with Rise, that was made with a different writer and a different screenwriter or screenwriters. And then when Matt Reeves took over, he really changed the direction to focus more on Caesar's arc as the founder of the ape civilization, which does go back, and there are certainly elements from the original series that I think we talked about briefly over the weekend that I'm looking forward to discussing on the podcast. And that it seems like there is a plan, which for me already, who was hesitant about just getting more for the sake of more, which does happen quite frequently. Like I'm eager and I'm excited to see this. This had a very successful opening weekend, which is awesome, which I'm hoping means we get more. So we would recommend it, and we can tell you more in spoilers, right? Like we both saw this, I think, in AVX, which for Canada is like IMAX Junior. So we were fortunate we got to see it on the early Wednesday screening, and of course recording this last minute. But that's typically how this goes. So yeah, like, and we also had a discussion that I'm gonna put on the record. So I'm looking forward to that about where it ranks amongst the 4 films we had so far. So I think Hailey and I give a thumbs up to this. If you're curious about it, I think you could actually dive into this having not seen any of them, because this is new, and I'd be curious if you see this and then are wanting to go back. It seems like a lot of, I mean, and don't use social media as an indicator of the success of a film, but I found in the last couple weeks more people talking about this trilogy than when it came out. And so
Mm.
revisiting these films, which are Dawn and War specifically, Rise is a good movie, but Dawn and War set themselves apart from Rise, and moving forward through this quadrilogy, I guess it would be a hexology. It doesn't matter. Shapes, numbers. And so we're going to move into spoilers. There is a lot to discuss because this is the longest of all the Planet of the Apes films in terms of runtime. And so we're going to jump into spoilers. If you haven't seen it yet, we would recommend it, and we can tell you more why now.
This is important.
All right. So you mentioned it briefly. Do you want to kind of set up like what? No, like we mentioned Noah's relationship with his clan. How did you feel? I think the main crux of the story that I found most compelling was what has carried forward, and almost the perversion of the morality or quote unquote laws that Caesar has left behind. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, and I think you like dove into a bit about Proximus and like only having pretty much like an hour or so to develop him as a villain. But I think I would say as like a beginning of a new trilogy, I would say it's so much more than him as a villain. I think what you're supposed to focus on is that Caesar's teachings have been turned into something else that nobody thought. And
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked. Like when they say, I don't remember what the gorilla says when they're attacking Noah's clan, but he's like for Caesar or something. Like you remember being shocked. You're like, holy shit, what's happening here? Um, and I had assumed that Noah's clan were descendants from Caesar's clan. Like I was like, oh, cool. Like they've developed a relationship where they're using eagles in terms of ceremony and like um, coming of age and all these things. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. And like when you establish their home, I would say, as I mentioned, like the beginning, it was different than what I had seen in Dawn. So I was confused. I was like, okay, they've changed the way that they live, they changed how they interact with different animals. Um, so I thought they did a really good job at that. And I think they did an even better job at showing the fans that there are other clans that exist and there are other clans that have used Caesar's teachings to gain power in other ways.
When even from a visual standpoint, the dynamic is so different. Where when we are introduced to Noah's bird eagle clan, for lack of a better description,
Hmm.
they are their nests or their large structures that they live in are kind of still a little bit familiar because they're built within electricity transformers. So it is still sort of reminiscent of even Dawn's like wood San Francisco woodland structure. And then when
Hmm.
you get to Kingdom, they're living out of rusted tanker ships. It's on the beach. In terms of aesthetic, it's much more similar to Planet of the Apes, which was obviously made more in California and had the big reveal at the end that we were still on Earth.
Hmm.
But Proximus as an antagonist, I found interesting because I would say he's actually more similar to somebody like Gary Oldman's character from Dawn, which was he's not really an out and out bad guy. Now, the way that his clan is treating other clans, that's more antagonistic on the spectrum of good and bad. But in general, his so the big thing is where the apes are all being brought in similarly ironically to war
Hmm.
where they're bringing in apes as manual labor, but if they're not of the clan now I wouldn't say they're necessarily being treated like slaves. It's more of like come to us, we have a job, we're not like whipping and beating you. It's a fine line to some degree, but in that there is so and this is where I liked the storytelling where we're filling in some of the gaps that we didn't see, right? Because the three previous films were all in Southern California. That's where they took place, or getting to northern when the snow shows up. The specifics of where that is, I actually don't think I know. Does it say exactly on the no 2 years following
Well,
California
San Fran, isn't
winter?
it? Like they're
Doesn't
outside
matter.
of San Francisco.
Yeah, would be more north for because we get the snow and the ice and everything in war. But in terms of the actual, so in going back to the world building and actually filling in those gaps without it being, and this is where I appreciate the level of screenwriting, which is in a bad movie, one of the apes sits down and goes, or a human and goes, so 200 years ago after Caesar died, a lot of apes just like spread out, and some of the missions stayed well, some of them didn't, and the humans they just like we don't get it's explained through the relationships. And in we so May, who is a smart human who's been traveling trying to find something, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but the humans, as a response to the simian flu, it's ironic given how I reviewed Fallout a couple weeks back, but created these bunkers, and inside the bunkers are ammunition, guns, technology that Proximus feels would help his apes move on to the next level. As opposed to I'm going to wipe all the humans out, which in a lesser movie, that's what his motivation would have been, right? He has a really great conversation, and he's a leveled villain. I really liked that from Kevin Durand. Like he's not just like mustache twirling. Like obviously I did my impression, and listeners will hear the actual clip moving or between the segments, but that it's about progression, right? He's an ape who has William H. Macy, who just plays a piece of garbage, who is another smart human reading to him. And I thought that was compelling. It we in lesser movies, as I said, he would have just been a bad guy.
Yeah.
And I know I without specifics couldn't talk about it in spoilers, but I liked how we get Proximus's version of the Caesar's teachings, and you brought it up. It is a shocking moment when his clan are invading the Eagle clan and they're saying for Caesar. And anybody who's seen the originals is like, what? No, that's not for Caesar. Apes no kill ape. Like this, that's one of
Yeah.
the there's like three rules,
And it
man.
makes you like angry. I remember feeling angry. I was like, this is the exact opposite.
How
Yeah.
dare you? Yeah. That's not
Yeah.
allowed. Caesar was a good
Yeah,
boy.
exactly.
Unless you were Koba and then you weren't
Hmm.
Ape. Such a great ending. And I liked how you need, and so I joked with the friend that I saw it with that you meet Raka and he's almost like Ape Morpheus from the Matrix, where he's like, welcome to my world. And he is almost like an apostle of Caesar's teachings and is carrying forward what the actual morality and messages were of that story. And his death, well, I don't know, did you feel like it was a little bit rushed?
A little bit. Like, I think he served his purpose. But
Mm-hmm.
I wish that there had been a little bit more of his teachings of Caesar's, like, I don't know, better lack of a better word, teachings. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because it would have been interesting to see how that carries forward. But at the same time, I also understand how this is like a new trilogy, so they'll probably be moving away from Caesar, and things like that, which like kind of makes me a little sad. But at the same time, I think it might be necessary. But it's interesting at the same time because Noah at the end wears the necklace. Um,
Mm-hmm. Until he gives it to May at the very end.
does she take
He
it?
takes
Does
it
she take
off.
it? I can't remember.
He Yeah, she takes
Uh,
it. So that to me was really interesting, where we're introduced to a smart human who is revealed at the very end. We're going to jump forward that she is one of the smart humans who are essentially trying to reestablish communication, and that element was such a pleasant surprise for me because to some degree, it's always been really interesting that they can kind of hold off Planet of the Apes. Like, we'll get there. But at the same time, after seeing this film, I kind of don't want them to do that. I I feel that they've done enough where they can kind of just keep telling the story without having to directly do one of the films. In introducing the human, I know you've seen Planet of the Apes, right? Of the
mhm.
originals, you haven't seen the other sequels, because I remember the summer either Dawn or Rise came out, we definitely watched the
Yeah, it
original.
was right after Rise. I haven't seen the Paul Giamatti one. The
Well, you're not missing outside of makeup. You're
yeah.
not missing anything. But what this teases specifically is, and one of the my favorite elements of this new franchise, like reboot franchise, is they take a lot of elements and they make it much more realistic. Because so in the second Planet of the Apes, beneath the Planet of the Apes, Charlton Heston's character learns that humans lived beneath the earth, or like underground, and that they'd survived a nuclear apocalypse and they were all telekinetic, and it was just it's 60s early 70s sci-fi, so it's really out there. But to have an element of, well, there are human civilizations that have survived and they're trying to maintain, and that the apes struggle with humanity is almost cyclical. We have multiple fights with Caesar. Noah to some degree has one in this one, where him and May, which so easily could have been, oh okay, like he's almost ignorant to the idea, but in what he experiences throughout his whole journey really molds him into becoming the new leader of the Eagle Clan after the death of his dad, and having to stand up to Proximus, and quite frankly, much more interesting ending, which is they defeat him as a group. It's not just like, oh, I'm the big tank now.
Yeah. I also really like how this franchise as a whole, like including Kingdom and the old movies, like play into the how complicated the relationship is with humans. Like it's never one way or the other. Like you have some good humans, you have some bad humans, but even with May, like you can't trust her. Like even at the end where she has like the gun behind her back, like she was fully prepared to kill Noah. Like I loved that
Mm-hmm.
because they can't trust each other, and I understand why, but I love how they dove into that, and it's not just like, oh, you're trying to get in the vault, I want to get in the vault because I want to free, my clan, let's be friends. It was never like that. And at the end of the day, she was just using him. Um, so I really
Mm-hmm.
like how that relationship played out. And I think with all four movies, they like the directors have done a really good job at making those relationships between ape and human complicated. Like it's never just one way or the other. And I love that.
Yeah, I'm really curious moving forward, particularly where there one of the elements of the previous trilogy that I thought worked out so interestingly was having Caesar and different humans every time because of the way that the world was continuously evolving. And I'm quite torn given how interesting the relationship was, as you just mentioned. Like, what does it look like if moving forward, knowing that they've communicated with like the group living in the a so-called abandoned factory with the satellite dishes, now that they've made contact, is this going to result in a second ape human war? Do I want to see Noah continue? It would be really interesting moving forward if through the remainder of this trilogy, if we do get to see more different ape colonies and really see a unification of all those groups. Because one of the parts of Planet of the Apes is they're so broken in terms of morality, and that is one of the main sticking points in the original film, which is like science versus their quote unquote religion. And I really don't know, given how I didn't really have expectations for what this story could be. I'm really excited about what the possibilities are. Do you want to see more Noah, or would you like to see a different group filling out more of the story? Because we know where the human story is going, where Noah's kind of comes to an end.
Yeah, it's true. It's an unknown. I think I'm curious to see more Noah, only because I know we chatted about it on the weekend, but like he does have a mark on his chest. So I don't know what that means, and I don't know how much this franchise or trilogy wants to be connected to the old one. Like I don't know if this is like, okay, we're gonna move on now, we're gonna create our own story, or if each movie is going to tie back somehow to Caesar as a leader. But I would be interesting because they've kind of teased this a little bit now that there are different clans. So I'd be curious to see what the other clans are like and how much they may or may not know about Caesar's teachings and laws and stuff like that. It would be interesting. I also want to see more orangutans.
Yeah.
I
Oh, I
love the
know. They're
orangutans.
so awesome. And like, I mean, you go from Maurice to Raqqa and it's just win after win.
Hmm.
What I would be really curious about, and it's we had minimal time jumps, like 10, 15 years, not I think it's 2 between Dawn and War. But an element that I would be curious about, talking about the realism that this version of the universe has established, are we going to get to a more evolved apes? Like, do we see clans closer to what Proxima wanted to be, right? Like, outside of the taser staffs, it's still pretty primitive in terms of everything, right? Like, yes, they're walking upright and speaking. I did like how there was still ASL.
Hmm.
That's an element, particularly where more and more films have included that. As somebody who's sign language is "Oh Canada" every morning, I like how that element was maintained.
Yeah, well, that's why I also thought they might be. That's why I also thought they might be descendants of Caesar's clan because Caesar's clan used ASL for the
Mm-hmm.
majority of Dawn. They don't really start speaking, and maybe a little bit in War, but many of them don't speak. But
Mm-hmm.
they only knew ASL because Caesar knew ASL because James Franco taught him ASL. So I'm like, okay, well then
Yeah.
how does this clan know ASL? Anyways, I'm creating storylines, but
Well, no, but that's what's interesting is given such a significant jump, there is a lot of mystery to how you get here. Now, I don't really want the again, I liked the elements that filled in the significant gaps, but to some degree, it is interesting having Caesar be this mythic character to some and not to others, right? Like it is an allegory for the use of religion in, I mean, modern human society, right? Like to some people, this is the guy. To other people, never even heard of
hmm.
him, right? And to that degree, they are becoming more human. But at the same time, that primal nature's still in there, particularly with like conflict resolution. Most of the time, it's with brutality. And we talked about Noah's his arc throughout this film in particular. I liked how he didn't just overpower the grayback gorilla or the silverback gorilla, because in a film that doesn't think this through as much, it would have been like, oh, he stabs him to death or something. But as the vault is being flooded, because that was part of their plan, we get a little like mini Planet of the Apes heist, which was a little fun. But that he realizes, if I go to a certain location, the gorilla ain't gonna get through, and he drowns to death. Not necessarily a happy moment, but for Noah, like his arc from just kind of being like the disappointment son to the leader is ironically kind of similar to Caesar's to some degree, where Caesar thrown into that ape zoo with Draco Malfoy, when he's thrown in there, the alpha sentiment is not actually true, but regardless, the way that the film presents it in Rise, that is Caesar's progression through there, right? He's getting beat up by the other apes. They rip off his cute J. Crew sweater. And if by the end of the film, he's their leader. And we have some mirroring in that with Noah. So as you mentioned with the mark, it does help identify him, but I'm curious, how does Noah really change now that he has this sentiment of what it meant to be a good ape, with Caesar as I think they called him the Grand Elder, right?
Yeah,
Because they all have
yeah,
elders, and yeah.
yeah. No, I'd be curious. Yeah, it'll be interesting to know, like, if we are introduced to new clans, and if this trilogy decides to tap in a little bit more into the old trilogy, like how much of Caesar's role is important or not important, if it plays into the story. Like, why give him the mark? Like, you can identify him in other ways, like they did it with the other apes. So that is interesting to me. Um, I also like how like different apes are using different ways of connecting with each other. Like I love how the eagle clan uses eagles. Like that's really cool. I'd never seen that before. And I also liked how with Proximus that, to your point, like they're trying to become humans in some way, and he keeps saying like evolution, but he actually doesn't know what it is. He just assumes there's something in
Yeah.
this vault that could help him, and he only knows that because of William H. Macy, who's telling him these things and reading him these things. But I think it's a really good way that they distinguish like ape from human, because they should. Like he's trying to become a human, but at the end of the day, he's not. So he doesn't understand what's in there. Um, and the fact that he doesn't know what guns are, which is really cool, because like Caesar's time, they all knew what guns were, they all used them. Um, so I like that distinguishment between the two, and how it was quite clear that like he's still an ape at the end of the day. Like he's smarter, but he's still an ape. He's not a human. So
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good point. And honestly, I think it's kind of what's most interesting about where the film puts everybody, where they're not walking around in human clothes. Like we're still not there, that there are still steps to whether we get Planet of the Apes in this film or in this trilogy, or maybe it's teased. If you're a longtime fan of this franchise in general, the Icarus spaceship was launched in 2011 in this universe. So I had predicted that potentially the post-credit scene was it was going to be landing. I don't think these apes are ready for that yet, but it's a compelling world that I'm really grateful that the care and effort that was so evidently put in the new trilogy was maintained, because this was on my most anticipated list of the year. It so easily could have been done wrong. There are nitpicks I do have that I don't think I would have noticed. I rewatched the trilogy leading up to this, and one element that I did notice, and it's because Matt Reeves pointed it out, which was anytime there was a moment of action or a stunt where a human could mocap it safely, they would do that. And in doing so, you don't have to use keyframe animation, which is when you are animating the whole thing all the way through without some serious reference. And that the climbing made me nervous in the beginning, because it's awesome and it's a great spectacle for what the world is like. It really does help establish what Earth looks like now. but it just looked like CGI apes. And I was so concerned I was going to be disconnected because of the performances of all the actors and all the work that Weta Digital, the visual effects company, put into the trilogy, that it wasn't going to be there. And I was so glad I was wrong, because while that opening sequence is really exciting, there's a lot more in there that there's no way they made a human do. Like when Noah drops 30 feet off of the tower when Proximus's clan invades. So outside of a couple real nitpicks, I was really impressed with this. So we discussed this, Hailey. So I'm going to let you do it, because we talked about this cards on the table yesterday, which was, if we were to rank the modern Planet of the Apes trilogy, starting at 4, how would the Film Realist podcast rank the 4 modern films?
4 being the worst, first being the best.
Well, yeah, and I wouldn't even say, honestly, it's just like good to great. Honestly, like, I don't want to use worst. Kung Fu Panda 4, it's the worst. But just in
No, it's true.
general, in this
Mm-hmm.
in this quadrilogy, how did we decided it? But I would like you to share it with the
Sure. So
listeners.
I would say 4 is Rise. To your point, Rise is good. It's just not my favorite. I think it does a really good job at
Mm-hmm.
establishing the universe and Caesar. So you can't have the other ones without Rise. Um, I would say 3 is Kingdom. Like you said, it was
Which is a little
it,
unfair because we don't know how the story
yeah, for
ends.
sure. So maybe we can revisit when we have all 6 and we can dive in. And it could be the same ranking. Like you have to establish this universe. You have to establish how Caesar's teachings have continued on or not continued on. I think the character development is very good. I would love to continue to follow these characters. I think we'd be a little heartbroken if we didn't. I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's interesting to see how the world has changed since Caesar's death. I would say War is number 2. Also very good. It's just a little bit slower.
It's more of a grand epic, where I think, like, so 1 is Dawn, and the gap between 2 and 1 is partially the only real stance for me, having rewatched them like within the last week, is that getting the duality of Koba and Dreyfus, Gary Oldman's character, is really interesting to see the duality. And they're almost at the antithesis, which is like Gary Oldman, just for the sake of him wanting to kill the apes for the sake of humanity, that he's a quote unquote antagonist. But then Koba is the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where it's like, I hate everyone, I'm just doing this. Right. And then,
Well, no, Koba's doing it because he's afraid. Like he hates humans and he hates that Caesar is giving them the time of day. He's like, why are you helping them when you know what they've done to me? So
what they're
like in
capable of.
Koba's world, it's
Yeah.
justified. Yeah. Um, but yeah, no, there's so many things that just make Dawn so good. Like if I had to choose a movie to rewatch, it would always be Dawn. Just because there's so much action, there's so much storytelling, you have good and bad on both sides. You get to see Caesar's family growth and development and how that plays into everything. Um, but yeah, that would
Yeah,
be my
Dawn's
ranking.
number 1. So starting at the bottom, it was Rise of the Planet of the Apes. Number 3, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Number 2, War for the Planet of the Apes. And then number 1, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. That will do it for our spoiler section of the review. Huge recommendation from Hailey and I. Let's jump into question of the week and the outro. All right, this previous week's question of the week was, who is your favorite Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman? It could be a fusion of live action or of just animation, television, film, anything was up. So, Hailey, we're going to react to the listeners' answers right now. Dylan Pollock wrote in, favorite Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Kevin Conroy is his Batman. Makes sense. George Newbern, so he was the voice in the Justice League cartoon of Superman with Kevin Conroy, as well as Susan Eisenberg, who was Wonder Woman. And he says, I'd like to also include Christopher Reeve, Michael Keaton, and Robert Pattinson. So 2 Batmans and 1 Superman up there too. Thank you. Callan, I hope I'm saying that right, Western said, I have to clear this so I can see everything. Sorry, Callan. There we go. The versions, so Callan responded on TikTok, the versions made for the 2004 series The Batman, an interesting show. Not a lot of discussion for that. It doesn't get a lot of love or mentions, but it has his favorite versions. Okay, thank you. Stephanie wrote in Tom Welling is her favorite Superman, aka Clark Kent, Christian Bale as Batman, and Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, in brackets, I guess. Sad there's not more to choose from. It is an unfortunate sentiment that, or not sentiment, it's just a fact that there's only really been 2 live action Wonder Woman women at this point. We will probably get more later on, but at this point, that's it. Scotty Cameron wrote in, he broke it up. Thank you, Scotty. Voices Tim Daly, so the voice of Superman from Superman the Animated Series, Kevin Conroy and Susan Eisenberg, so from the DCAU. And then live action, he broke it down. You weren't supposed to do both, Scotty, but I'll read them anyways. Tom Welling as Clark Kent / Superman, Christian Bale as Batman, and Linda Carter. The voice actors are the best overall castings. Okay. And last, Junkyard Jill wrote in Michael Keaton, Christopher Reeve, and Linda Carter. That's it. The end. Period. That's hilarious.
Okay,
Thank
Jill.
you, Jill, for the reaction to the mail. I'm honestly, for me, it is hard to distinguish the difference between the live action and the animation. Anybody who watched the DC animated universe, you spent way more time with them. So it's not really shocking that they're the most, but in general, my favorite live action Batman is Ben Affleck. I like the DCEU for the most part, but Superman, Christopher Reeve, I've watched that film a lot. And Linda Carter's Wonder Woman, she had a long time for her television series. So that's not, it's difficult. I know it was a complicated question asking for both. I know your favorite Batman is Kevin Conroy. That's the end of the story. So
No Henry Cavill
Henry
in there.
Cavill's been great. Unfortunately, he didn't get to be Superman for very long, which is it's unfortunate. I didn't have time for this in this week's episode, but I did finally see The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. So it's been released on digital rental. So if you live anywhere outside of the United States, you can now watch it. Thanks, Amazon, for the weirdest release schedule, maybe of all time. Next week's question of the week is, which is your favorite of the modern Planet of the Apes trilogy, or quadrilogy at this point? There have been 4 films. I could completely understand why any of them is your favorite. We've ranked ours, but I'm curious on what yours is. Next week's episode of I opened the wrong app. Sorry, listeners. I do have this booked in my calendar. Next week's episode of the podcast is going to be a big one. So you are going to want to make sure you are following for that. It will be a review of If, John Krasinski's new films starring Ryan Reynolds about imaginary friends, and a full season 1 review of X-Men 97. Don't skip that theme song or we cannot be friends. Hailey, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
We will likely have Hailey back for Planet of the Apes. I've been having a hard time coming up with what the next one's going to be. They've had such great titles in front of it. Kingdom wouldn't have been one I would have predicted either. So who knows?
No, well, to be honest, too, like when this came out, I didn't think there'd be more. I didn't look into that there'd be more. So I was like, oh, it's a great 4th title.
Yeah, it is.
Thinking there wouldn't be more. Yeah. And then I saw the end and I was like, oh, there's going to be more.
Battle's
so
been used, Conquest, Beneath. Like there is another one. I can't remember. It might be Return to, but all of them have been so good. And okay, so before we end the show, I am not a fan of people going back and looking at the titles of things. It's happened with these. It's happened with Star Wars where it's like, oh, they're named wrong. No, they're titled what they're titled. You don't get to just be like, oh no, Attack of the Clones is this one or Revenge. No, that's what the title is. You don't just get to move it because you think it fits another film. I hate this thing. It's been a trend on social media lately. That's the end of my rant. Please like and share the podcast with your film-loving friends. My goal is to have a pretty big episode for episode 100, so that's in about 10 weeks. So please like and share it with your friends. leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform. Follow on any of the social medias for any updates. If you are enjoying trailer reactions in general, the best place to see them in full is either Instagram or TikTok. I have to cut them for shorts so that way they stay vertical on YouTube, so you can follow the podcast on all those avenues. I have some fun stuff coming out that I can't tell you about yet, so make sure you are listening to each and every episode, because I'm going to start to lay a little breadcrumbs as to what you can expect in the near future. My name is Kyle Naranya. We'll see you next time.